Ryan, thank you all for the eye-opening session around the consequences of noncompliance and defense contractor exposure to the False Claims Act. So now that we've touched on the legal exposure around noncompliance, what about the evolving threat landscape? Why is the government legally mandating all of these cybersecurity controls? What's the threat? Well, our next speaker has served in senior positions of strategy and diplomacy within the Defense and State Departments for more than 26 years. He retired as a brigadier general. He was the chief architect for the Trump administration's widely praised national security strategy and the senior director for strategy to the president at the National Security Council. He is a national security expert, a patriot, entrepreneur, and the CEO of Secure EMP-Resistant Edge, SEMPRE. He's also possibly the most qualified person on the planet to speak to us today about China's role in the theft of intellectual property across the defense industrial base. Please join me in welcoming retired General Robert Spalding.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be back. I'm looking forward to all the meetings that are going to happen today and the conversation. Really looking forward to discussing our future and current threat landscape. One of the most consequential things to have happened recently was the new AUKUS agreement. The AUKUS agreement really ushers in this idea of a bipolar world. If you've been following that in the news, the narrative really has been about the upset French with regard to the sale of nuclear sub-technology from the U.S. to Australia. The submarine that the French were supplying was a diesel-electric submarine. The configuration was turning out to be very complicated and really didn't suit the needs for Australia, considering the rise of China. But it's broader than that. It's not just about the French being upset about losing a contract to Australia. It's not about a fracturing of the alliances that came after the end of World War II. It's really about setting the course for the future. And if you recall, back in 1946, there was a famous trip made by an ex-government official from the UK to the United States, and he ended up giving a speech in St. Louis. This speech became known as the Iron Curtain speech. And Churchill spent a lot of time working with Harry Truman, going over what he was going to say. He talked to the Secretary of State and the Undersecretary, who had some minor comments to make on the speech. But overall, they agreed with the sentiment. It's important to note at the time that Europe was not in agreement with what Churchill said. And in fact, much of the United States was not in agreement at the time. We had just come out of World War II. Nobody really was interested in facing down the Soviet Union. And most people, both in Europe and the United States, didn't even see the Soviet Union as a threat, much less an authoritarian system. In fact, there was widespread belief that the Soviet Union could be very much like the United States in terms of having democratic principles. At the same time that Churchill was making his trip to the United States for this famous speech, something called the Long Telegram was making its way from Moscow to Washington, D.C. So George Kennan wrote the Long Telegram, and it's something that national security strategists continue to read to this day because it laid out the challenge that we face with the Soviet Union, the challenge that the Soviet Union presented to the free world. And this idea of an international order governed by the UN or mediated by the UN is perhaps a better term, and how the Soviet Union was going to run counter to that ideologically. Kennan laid out the challenge of the Soviet Union, as did Winston Churchill in St. Louis during his Iron Curtain speech. Now, that was probably, if you had been alive at the time, that would be something like maybe even less noteworthy than what's going on here with the AUKUS agreement. But nevertheless, it is considered both of those things, the Iron Curtain speech and the long telegram. It's basically, they are seminal moments in this turn towards a bipolar world. And I think rather than thinking about the disagreement with the French with regard to the submarines, we should begin to look at the AUKUS agreement as another seminal moment as we go away from this multipolar world, which really, it was unipolar. Now it's gone more multipolar to more of a bipolar system. And you're seeing that with the rise of the Belt and Road Initiative, and then certainly with the disagreements internationally with regard to how we should treat Huawei. The agreement itself is really focused on technology. Things like artificial intelligence and quantum are going to feature much more prominently in the relationship between the US, Australia, and the UK in the years to come. And that's what the agreement ushers in. In fact, the submarines is not really a key feature of that. One of the things that we should be aware of with regard to the submarine is the fact that it really talks about the underlying strategic challenge that we face in the Indo-Pacific. What are we talking about here? Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party has many times talked about its need to reclaim Taiwan. And as Xi Jinping has been in power now, going on what looks like to be a third term, the aggressiveness with which China has approached Taiwan, India, and other countries on its border, and really with regard to the Indo-Pacific writ large, the islands in the South China Sea, it's becoming clear, much more clear than it was when Deng Xiaoping talked about biding time and hiding capability. It's much more apparent that there's going to be a military edge to the expansionism practiced by the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army. But it doesn't necessarily have to lead to the type of conflict that we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. And in fact, it's likely that we can evade that, but only by thinking about something that we haven't thought about in 30 years, and that's nuclear deterrence. So how do we prevent war? How do we make sure that competition stays in the areas that don't allow for conventional conflict, where bombs and bullets and certainly destruction and death have to be a part of. In fact, when you think of the two wars that preceded the Cold War, World War I and World War II, the level of destruction and death from conflict is exponentially smaller and has stayed so. Part of the reason for that has been the ability for governments like the Soviet Union, now Russia, and China and the United States and other nuclear powers to recognize the terrible nature of nuclear weapons and the fact that it's probably not a good idea to get in the conflict. And in fact, where Milley's comments really get to the heart of with regard to his call with China, it's really about maintaining stability in terms of confrontation and crisis. And so, the U.S. government worked very hard in the Obama administration on the confidence building measures to ensure that, when the People's Liberation Army and the U.S. military met at sea or in the air, that we ensured that we were abiding by an idea where we didn't want to have crisis lead to confrontation. In fact, when I got to Beijing in December of 2016, within a week, I was involved in a very severe crisis when the People's Liberation Army took one of our unmanned underwater vehicles in the South China Sea. I was involved with negotiating that. And I can tell you for a fact that the U.S. government and the Chinese government were very, very concerned about crisis leading to confrontation. So what does the AUKUS agreement portend for the Indo-Pacific? Well, it's likely that many of the deterrent features that were in the first Cold War, but mostly centered on Europe, will see that come to play within the Indo-Pacific. And we should be hopeful that that is the case, because nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence tend to focus confrontation and competition really in other areas like technology, like data, like artificial intelligence, like quantum computing. And so as the AUKUS agreement really begins this effort to rekindle a bipolar world and really sets the strategic framework for how we will address this competition, and it's primarily an ideological competition, then we have to wonder, what does it portend for the rest of the world in terms of what do we think about peacetime day to day? How do we consider that in our lives, in our businesses? How do we consider that in our strategies with regard to how we grow our businesses and protect our intellectual property? This is going to be where the weight of the second Cold War is really felt. One of the things that in talking to strategists like Henry Kissinger and others about the world of the 20th century and the first Cold War is this idea of geography as a defining matrix for competition. In other words, there was a constant recognition of the importance of geography to the overall strategy. Things like the Fulda Gap, the domino effect in Southeastern Asia. These were all considerations of the 20th century, and really it were considerations of a much more militarily focused strategy. That's not going to be the case this time. This time, it's much more about data and the use, or better yet, the misuse of data. How is data going to be manipulated and misused to create influence and disinformation? How is it going to be used to acquire intellectual property and to undermine the fabric of civil society and democracies? Well, interestingly enough, we've gotten a big dose of that over the last 2 years. If you take a step back and you go back in time to the beginning of or the end of 2019, there was, as we know now, there was recognition within China that there was a spreading virus. And that virus was leading to pneumonia-like cases in hospitals around Wuhan. China was dealing with that at the time. It's likely that the senior leadership in Beijing were aware. Yet there was no notice made to the World Health Organization or any other global health organizations or the CDC about this challenge, even though it's believed that some of the attendees for the military games that were held in November in Wuhan got infected from that virus. And so there was, here is an example of the complete lack of continuation with the type of system that was envisioned after World War II, and that really we led during the Cold War. And that was this idea of the focus on facts and transparency, on rule of law, on the United Nations being a forum for promoting these principles. In fact, what we've seen is the exact opposite. Now, I think 4 of 15 agencies within the United Nations are led by Chinese candidates, one being Tedros for the World Health Organization. And as we saw in January, Tedros, in fact, at the behest of the Chinese Communist Party, kept this spreading pandemic under wraps as people that were infected were leaving China and going to all points of the globe. So as the pandemic accelerated, this disinformation campaign and influence campaign took on completely different aspects that are probably could not be conceived of at the time. For example, the report that said over 2 million Americans would die comes out of the Imperial College of London, not a Chinese university, but a university in London, where in 2015 Xi Jinping visited, and the Chinese Communist Party began to give funds to do things, among which were epidemiology research. So that biased report that came out, I think it was March of 2020, and which I read at the time and recognized that the data coming out of Italy about what was happening with regard to the virus and the numbers that they were projecting in that report were completely off kilter. And if you go back and look at that, the Imperial College of London has been consistently biased towards more deaths in their reporting since. What else was coming out about that time from China? This idea of people falling down on the street and really not being able to catch themselves. But if you go back and look now at those videos, they're still available online. They actually are catching themselves. And so what we had was an ability, a report that created fear and social media that inflamed fear. And then that became embedded in our media and political systems. And it exists today. It continues today. And the effort by the Chinese Communist Party to use all the powers and levers of that Silicon Valley created, after the end of the Cold War, have been used in force to create and perpetuate this idea of fear, and then to inform the policy making of both the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control. Lockdowns, widespread lockdowns never existed. In fact, were not called for in any of the CDC's pandemic approaches or the World Health Organizations. In fact, the World Health Organization themselves said lockdowns have really never been tried before. You can go back and see the press release from the World Health Organization if you disagree. And so today we have a good idea of what this new world looks like, this new global competition, and what the threat really is. And the threat is really in defining what are facts, what is the truth, and in particular, how does a free society maintain some semblance of civility and social cohesion when an authoritarian or totalitarian regime is picking at the threads of that social cohesion. It's really about the infrastructure, and that's where I think the AUKUS agreement is beginning to point the way. How do we build the fabric of our IT systems? How do we protect our democracies? How do we protect our technology? These are the things that are going to feature in terms of what are the major muscle movements that have to happen in order for us to be successful. Because right now it is not clear that the free world will be successful in turning back authoritarianism. While democracies thrived at the end of the Cold War and for some time after that, there's been a flattening of that growth and in fact, a rollback and a decline of free societies. In fact, we're seeing that accelerate in the aftermath of the coronavirus, the decline in civil liberties and really the type of liberties that Americans and other people that live in democracies have come to know and respect. We're seeing a backsliding of that, and really there's an acceptance that it's needed, and it's really because of this fear that's been inflamed by very much of what the Chinese Communist Party has done. But then it's been amplified by our own media and political system. That's just a feature of democracies. And so how do we protect that? That's really going to be the job of the people that are tasked with dealing with this new Cold War, the new Cold War that's focused around data, the use of data, artificial intelligence, quantum. Where does quantum play in that arena? Well, this idea that there is data being siphoned off right now as we speak today, and in anticipation of a quantum computer that's strong enough to break the RSA encryption. And in fact, we know that is going on. So we need to incorporate, and we really have to do this much like with the kind of fervence that we dealt with Y2K. We need to begin encrypting with using quantum, post-quantum secure regimes. And we're not talking about quantum key distribution here, which is a much more fragile technology. What we're talking about is quantum random number-based encryption, where a quantum computer is not going to be able to crack. There are several companies now that are beginning to introduce encryption like that. We need to look at them. We need to, figure out which ones are the ones that can carry us through and actually stand up to scrutiny. And the NIST really has to lead the way on that. And we have several efforts on that. But when you think about where we're at in terms of a country right now, or even as a free world, we're lagging behind where we need to be. We need in place standards for quantum secure encryption, and that's a huge importance. Artificial intelligence. Why is that such an important technology? Well, when you think about what Kai-Fu Lee says, who's one of the leading thought provokers and leaders in China with regard to artificial intelligence, worked for Google, and is now wrote a book called The AI Superpower. When you look at what he says in subsequent comments, what he talks about is this idea of the Saudi Arabia of data. China seeks to become the Saudi Arabia of data. And in fact, the President Trump was told by the leadership in China that they believe that they are going to have preeminence in artificial intelligence. And in fact, whoever has preeminence in artificial intelligence will be the top dog, and they will get to dictate the terms of the systems. And so that is what this idea of Saudi Arabia of data means to China. It means the ability to dictate the terms of the international order. And in fact, they are proceeding along that route. If you look at the companies themselves, companies like ByteDance or SenseTime, the artificial intelligence is really quite good. The ability to take TikTok data that's been gleaned from your phone and then serve up videos that will keep you captivated for hours is built into the ByteDance algorithms. What else is built into this TikTok ByteDance environment? Well, it's the ability to serve up videos that you will continue to watch, but that subtly send a message that the Chinese Communist Party wants you to hear. In fact, if you go on TikTok today, you can go and find these videos. And it's many different people from different walks of life with different backgrounds, but they're uttering the exact same terms. They're saying the exact same thing. They're reading essentially from a script that has been produced for them. And so TikTok, ByteDance really work to create this environment where they understand your what you like, and then begin to serve videos. That's just one use of where technology is going. 5G is not the main problem there. There is just the ability of your device to take data from you and then use that data to influence to create algorithms to influence your decision making. But it gets bigger and it gets broader. And in fact, in China, the social credit score really takes that idea and spreads it throughout society into everything it permeates everything that goes on. So cameras that are powered by artificial intelligence to track your movements, to see what you do. In fact, today cameras can be used to not just recognize somebody, they can recognize actions. Has somebody fallen and gotten hurt? Is somebody entering a door that they shouldn't be doing? Is somebody doing some kind of action that they shouldn't be doing at the time. All these things can be determined using machine learning and streaming video, and that can be incorporated in part of a broader system to surveil and control the population. Things like contact tracing can be in some ways very positive for the population, but in other ways can really lead to a decline in civil liberties. For instance, GDPR data today that's collected with regard to software development kits for smart devices, and ad data that is used to serve up ads to your device really can be combined to create a landscape where you have full understanding of a person, a group, a geographic location. You can go to any base in the military and figure out who's who on the base just by taking some of that data and doing some very rudimentary analysis. You can find out where the commander lays his or her head at night, where they're traveling to. You can find out where airplanes are deploying to. You can find out where ships are deploying to. You can find out literally everything you need to know about the operations of the Department of Defense just by relying on rudimentary analysis, software development kits, and data, and ad data. And this is something that can be automated, this type of analysis, to provide alerts about, deployments and other things. So that's just what's freely available data on the open market. And we're not talking about Huawei equipment that's siphoning data back to China. We're just talking about what's freely available there on the open market. So when you think about that in terms of not just a national security sense, but in terms of how do you protect your business when your business can be entirely attacked in this way or surveilled, and then to look for vulnerabilities. And in fact, that's what you can do is find vulnerabilities, find vulnerability people, find, people like, your network administrator and what they're doing, and potentially, gain some kind of knowledge that would be used to put them under duress, and then gain access to passwords or something for a network. These are all capable and, available today to anybody, really the highest bidder that puts money towards this data. It's really about how we harness it and use it. Beyond that, if you take a God's eye view of the United States or any democracy for that matter, the way that we deployed infrastructure for the mobile arena is itself vulnerable. In fact, we found that out during the Christmas bombing down in Nashville last year, where Nashville or Tennessee and surrounding states lost E911 and mobility for almost 2 weeks, just by a contractor that formerly worked for AT&T setting off a bomb near their switching center and taking the network offline. If you take that God's eye view of the United States today, there's a lot of single point failures in our system. Now, AT&T rushed mobile network nodes to get that stood back up, and they had operations going, by the end of 2 weeks. But the problem remains that we have a very vulnerable system that has been highly centralized, highly co-located, and is derived from a hub and spoke platform. At any cell tower, there is a room at the base of the cell tower where the baseband units are stored. And there's many data centers where baseband units are stored for networks. Those baseband units are common areas for network service providers. So depending on who's built your network, they have access to anybody else that has radios, installed at the top of that tower. So right now, our platform, as it currently exists, is incredibly vulnerable to siphoning data, regardless of what we're talking about with the SDK data and ad data. So we have an open system in terms of attack. So if you're trying to protect data in the United States, it's going to be very difficult. And then finally, the what are the benefits of 5G, and how can you secure those benefits to a free people? Well, really, it's about how do you prevent that data from being siphoned and then turned around and misused in ways that are counter to our system. So we've been talking about mobile devices, but when you start to deploy cameras and microphones and other devices throughout the environment, then that collection of data really starts to come from those devices and not your mobile phone. So even if you've heeded all the lessons of mobile security, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be protected, because artificial intelligence is going to power those systems that are connected, and that those videos of you doing things are going to be shared by someone, stored somewhere. GDPR, Global Data Protection Regulation, was meant to protect you from that kind of intrusion into your privacy. But what we found is, even with GDPR data, just based on some rudimentary analysis, you can take that data and then identify who somebody is. How does that work? Well, say somebody works on the flight line at Barksdale Air Force Base and they go home every night. Well, you can see that, and then once they begin to go to a place where you can determine who lives there, who owns the place, who's rented the place, for a hotel room, then you can quickly correlate an identity with that device, and then it just becomes a tracking exercise then. So it's really about putting different disparate sets of data together, and 5G really enables this at scale. It enables it at scale in a way that the mobile phone environment gives you some aspect of, but there's stuff that you're not going to be able to get. But in the 5G world, you're really going to have that. So how do you protect that? How do you protect AI? How do you ensure that the AI algorithms for facial recognition, say if you walk into a 7-Eleven, pick up a bag of chips and walk out and get charged for paying for those chips, all using a camera and an algorithm, how do you ensure that all that data about what you did in that store is kept private and it's anonymized? Well, that's something that is going to have to be built into the platform to protect AI. And if you don't build that in, then you're creating this world where it's very easy to manipulate you. How is it easy to manipulate you? Take that data and aggregate it over your life, aggregate it over a week, over a year. And then when you recognize some of the things that are happening today in our society, which are actually quite prevalent in China, where you can see that if you say did something that somebody doesn't approve of, you could find yourself fired. You could find yourself kicked out of your university. You could find yourself not able to go into a place of business. These are all things that we've seen in the last 2 years that are built into this framework of surveillance at scale, and then the ability to use that data in other ways. Endemic to this rise of technology and this focus away from geography and onto data is this ability to globalize political warfare. And that's really what we're talking about. The Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army are by and large experts at political warfare. Now, where the United States and in particular people like myself were trained to understand how you apply violence to achieve a political outcome, this is foreign to us. I was never taught about political warfare in any of my professional military education. I was a B-2 pilot during the Kosovo War. I helped plan missions there. I watched as over that 2-month war how we used B-2s and joint direct attack munition, 2,000-pound GPS guided bombs to, in the beginning, take out empty barracks, or ammo dumps, but then later, during the last 2 weeks of the war, how we had defined the network supporting Milosevic, the elites in the country, and how we systematically began to take out assets belonging to those elites. Within 2 weeks of that process starting, the war was over and Milosevic was at The Hague. How did that happen? Well, it was really understanding the network within Serbia that was supporting Milosevic and then making those people pay a political price. So that is, the type of warfare that I was taught as a B-2 pilot and throughout my professional military career. That is not the way that the Chinese Communist Party or the People's Liberation Army think about warfare. They think in terms of politics. In fact, the way the Chinese Communist Party was able to win the civil war in China was by undermining the faith and confidence of the Chinese people in the Nationalist Party that was ruling China at the time. The Nationalist Party fled to Taiwan, and while Taiwan stayed a single-party system for a long time, today is the most thriving democracy in Asia. Meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party has continued to dominate its own borders, but then with the introduction of the Silicon Valley technology and globalization, has increasingly spread its influence or disinformation and influence outside of its borders. And I already talked about that, how that works today. But it only accelerates going forward. And in fact, one of the things that you recognize is the easiest way for the Chinese Communist Party to influence our political system is through the corporate, the U.S. corporations and other multinational corporations of the free world. Companies that are in China, like Huawei, don't have to lobby the U.S. government for access to our markets. They can get their suppliers to lobby for them. In fact, the biggest lobbyists for Chinese companies in Washington, D.C. and other capitals around the world are the corporations that actually want to have access to Chinese markets. One of the things I learned very clearly in Washington, D.C. is that policy is very much a process between the corporate sector and Washington, D.C. And in fact, the corporate sector has enormous influence on the policymaking process in Washington, D.C. All China did was figure out a way to harness so that those corporations were incentivized to use that political process to achieve outcomes that China wanted. And whether that has to do with tariffs or whether that has to do with entity lists or whether that has to do with listing their stocks on U.S. stock exchanges, whether that has to do with the ability of institutional investors like pension funds to invest in Chinese companies, whether that has to do with venture investment into U.S. startup, high technology startups. These are all things that are featured with our globalization and internet connectivity. So not only can the Chinese Communist Party reach out and influence our corporate sector, given the tools of Silicon Valley, they can reach out at the individual level. So if you think about the way that the West practiced war, theorists like Clausewitz and Jomini, and more recently like John Boyd and the author of the first Gulf War strategy with his 5 wings theory, John Warden. There's a recognition that military force should be used on the leaders to affect their decision calculus to achieve a political outcome. And this was the way that we addressed, again, the Kosovo War. One of the things that Warden notes, and it's pretty much taken for a gospel, is that you never, as a particular from an airplane standpoint, you never go after the population. The population is the hardest to go after. In fact, if you do go after the population, their tendency is to get mad at the attacker, not at their government, and that is counter to achieving a good political outcome in a war scenario. Well, in the case of the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army, using the tools of Silicon Valley, they can actually go directly to the population itself and begin to change the perceptions and motivations and decision making of the population. How does that work in China? Well, it really works through this idea of self-censorship, this idea that you conform your behavior to the pattern that the party wants because you know that it will have a negative impact on your person if it doesn't. It starts in kindergarten, where kids fight to get awarded the red sash. The red sash signifies that they are the best communists in class, and all the they get all the benefits. And then if you're a nonconformist or you don't work hard, then you get less or you get punished. And really, it starts then and continues on throughout society, down to today, where you have the social credit score, and so people are continuously and positively reinforced that if they do what the Chinese Communist Party wants, they will be rewarded. We are seeing elements of that in our society today. You are judged by what you say, how you think, and anything you can or say and do can, in many cases, will be held against you. You could find yourself censored on social media. You could find yourself fired. In fact, we're looking at literally tens of thousands of medical professionals are getting fired, as we speak in New York for not wanting to take vaccinations. So this is an effort that technology and globalization and this ability to be interconnected with other authoritarian regimes ensures that ability to reach across borders, much like me and a B2 and a JDAM from the United States to Serbia. Now that happens at the speed of light. It took something like 30 hours to get to Serbia from Missouri. Now you can do these things at the speed of light, and you can do them at scale in the population. You can slowly begin to pick at the fabric of social cohesion using many of the technologies that were designed to sell more shoes, and that is endemic to the system that we have. So we have a severe challenge. It's a technology challenge. It's a challenge that we're going to have to rise to as a people, not just in the United States, but in countries around the world. We're going to have to understand how we protect infrastructure, how we protect data, how we ensure things like AI and quantum are integrated in our lives in ways that promote the principles and values of our democracy, or we risk losing it. I think I'd like to say a little bit about the necessity of space in all of this. One of the things I looked at when I was in the White House studying 5G was this idea of backhaul and using space for backhaul for telecom networks. Now we see the deployment of large constellations like Starlink, like OneWeb. These are incredible, technology and infrastructure deployments that have the potential of spanning this divide and creating that kind of global fabric for connectivity. But what's the supply chain? Who controls it? Who has access to it? How is it protected? How is it secured? These are all things that, quite frankly, it's as we move from this era where government controlled space to one where it's being much more commercialized. This ability to protect the infrastructure of space is not built into the world of Silicon Valley, which is now extending into space. So not only now do we have this terrestrial world that has been built and filled with insecurity and the ability to leverage for global political warfare, now the space environment is going to be brought into it. And so while it does have the potential of lifting humanity, it also has the potential for creating future challenges for humanity in terms of democratic systems. Countries like the United States are increasingly relying on the commercial sector to put up its space assets as well. So how that is hardened and made resilient and secure and survivable is a key component of sovereignty and national security. And it's not entirely clear at all how that is going to be done in a commercial sense to ensure that when you need access to space, you have access to space. These things like high performance computing, cloud and virtualization, telecommunications, space and satellite, and security, all are at the cornerstones and foundations of how we build a more secure future. And yet they, as you look around the landscape there, that technologies, those capabilities, that expertise is primarily now in China for the most part, or aligned with China. It's not brought together in a way that is comprehensive in terms of security or reliability or survivability. And so this ability to harness data about people and then leverage it in ways that are counter to the founding principles of our democracy is a key challenge. And space is going to be that element of extra added threat that we see for this competition that, quite frankly, wasn't featured in the last one because government, for the most part, owns space. So as you bring these systems together, what should we be looking for in terms of how do we cope? How do we preserve our republic in the face of all this? Well, the national security strategy really focused on these ideas of protect, rebuild, and inspire. And even though the words aren't in the national security strategy, I can tell you, as having worked on it, the intent was written into it. Protect. What does that mean? It really means about protecting institutions of our democracies, our technology, our different areas of our society, like academic, political, economic, financial, trade, industrial base, manufacturing, infrastructure. It's about really protecting all those things from the predations of those that would seek a different system for the world. And so things like going after scientists in academia who are simultaneously doing work for the Department of Defense and the People's Liberation Army. That's an important thing to do. There's a recent report that came out of the National Institute of Health that said 90%, fully 90% of their research was also going in conjunction with the Chinese. So 90% of their research for NIH was going to China. Things like, corporations who are employing Chinese nationals who have a requirement by the Chinese Communist Party to provide the type of information that will allow for civil-military fusion to rise in China. In other words, to power China's economy and their military. The fact that these Chinese nationals reside in nearly every corporation in the United States, and it's not because the challenge is not because of their race. It's really because of the system that they come from. It comes from an authoritarian or a totalitarian system where the Chinese Communist Party has enormous influence over their lives. So your ability to operate independently in China, it should be clear now that is not a possibility. The idea that corporations and companies who are doing business in China can find their employees be under duress for doing business in China. The two Michaels from Canada who were released almost at the same time that Meng Wanzhou's was released back to China. Yet we are made to believe, or meant to believe, that there was no quid pro quo. Maybe perhaps the Chinese Communist Party never told the Canadian government that they would release them directly, but it happened. Nevertheless, it happened. Also, there were two young Chinese kids, citizens of America, that had been held in China for 3 years and were recently released on the eve of Meng Wanzhou's release back to China. So this idea of hostage diplomacy is going to feature in something that, so protecting our citizens from those types of predations is heavily featured in the national security strategy, and something that we must put into place. In fact, today I'm very well aware that the corporate sector is constantly lobbying the U.S. government and Congress to take down these protections that were put in place beginning in 2018, and then dismantle them because it's harming business with China. So protecting is a key component of how we get around this, protecting our society, institutions, our technology. But then we can't stop there. Rebuilding is a key component of this. And that's where this AUKUS agreement, I think, really shines. This idea that we're going to take capital, and in fact, the United States has 40% of the investable capital of the world, and we're going to invest it in ourselves, in our allies and partners, in democracies, and we're going to build manufacturing or rebuild manufacturing. We're going to rebuild crumbling infrastructure, which today is rated a D by the American Civil Engineering Society. We're going to rebuild those things that help drive a productive economy. And in fact, this is very, very consistent with what we did during the Cold War. During the Cold War, we built things like the Eisenhower National Highway System, which, when you combined, over long-haul trucking, really has provided tremendous economic value to the United States. Only when it was built in the 50s, it was built as a means, in some respects, to provide for national security uses. So the fact that you could land airplanes on long stretches of the Eisenhower International Highway System was featured heavily in the marketing and in the political discussion with regard to where are we going to build this national highway system. We have to do things like that again. I advocated that it was very important that we had a national digital system that was hardened, survivable, and secure, much like the Eisenhower highway system. We needed a 21st century digital highway system. These are still things that are needed today, and rebuilding our country in these ways with technology, manufacturing, infrastructure. These are all very important and heavily featured in the strategy. But ultimately, they go nowhere without execution. The government, the political process has to work towards solutions that benefit the American people. And unfortunately, today, that it is less about the American people, and it's more about individual projects that don't really move the needle forward. So somehow we need to get the political process on board to really begin to rebuild this country. And then finally, inspire. The last part of it is really about looking outward and really understanding what makes somebody come to America. Why would somebody come to America? Why would they leave their country, the country of their birth, to come to America? What are they looking for? What do they want? And really understanding that is the true nature of this competition. And to the extent that we can tap into that we can harness that we can leverage that, then we're going to be fine. And really, it's about building the ability to live your life according to the precepts in the Constitution. Prosperity, liberty. These are all things that Alexander Hamilton and the other framers of the Constitution were looking. How can I live my life and raise my family and provide a better life for my kids? That is what immigrants come to America for. And that's the thing that we are fighting to preserve. But you cannot preserve that in an environment where you lose those principles and values because you have the ability for foreign nations and others to come in and subvert them. And that's what we unfortunately built after the end of World War II and the Cold War. And in terms of inspiring, it's far less clear that the United States is very inspiring around the world now for people. And why is that? Well, because in many ways we displaced our prosperity and our liberty. We displaced our manufacturing. We stopped investing in ourselves, and we started investing in China. And that was made for a national security reason. It was made in the flawed belief that if we could rebuild China in the way that we rebuilt Europe and Japan and Korea and Taiwan after World War II, that as they grew in prosperity, that they would become more like us. Unfortunately, we got out of the habit of actually tying what we did, who we invested in, how we did business to the principles and values that are enshrined not just in our Constitution or Bill of Rights, but also in things like the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter, which is all of one page, a document signed by Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, really outlines the nature of the international political order that they sought to build after the end of World War II. And it still is a great template today for looking at the world order. I would say that the big challenge, though, is that we've moved beyond the world of geography and paper to the digital world that is much easier to subvert. It's much easier and much more cost effective for the Chinese Communist Party to employ millions to do social media monitoring and censoring and to inject influence and disinformation into countries around the world, and for the likes of Russia and Iran and North Korea to do the same. It's much easier for them to harness that global technology than was ever possible before. And in many ways, the way we designed it was counter to a democracy like our own. And it's we've created a digital space that's very freewheeling and almost a Wild West environment. So, inspiring people by living our best lives and being our best selves is increasingly difficult in this globally connected, globalized world. And so we're going to have to find a way to coexist with our allies and friends as well as our rivals, but do so in a way that promotes the principles of democracy and liberty, rule of law, free trade, the idea that people have the right to determine how they want to live. These are all things that we must figure out a way to promote in this environment, or we risk losing this second Cold War. So I have a fundamental belief that America and its allies and partners can rise to the occasion. We have faced challenges before. We will face challenges again. This challenge is an entirely new challenge, much like the aircraft changed warfare forever. The internet has changed it forever as well, and perhaps in a more destructive way from a societal perspective and from a democratic perspective than we've ever seen before. Airplanes have led to great destruction and death, and mostly that is a sad commentary on humanity. Yet we cannot shy away from humanity when we're thinking about this next evolution of warfare, which features global political campaigns. We must start to think more inwardly and more and much more strongly about what we believe and how we protect and preserve the sanctity of those beliefs, and how, most importantly, and this is probably the most critical, how we enable a society where we can agree to disagree and work together to promote the common prosperity and freedom of not only our society but those societies that are allies and partners to us. And I think this is the piece that that if we do a good job of that, you're going to see this idea that China provides a better model for societies around the world begin to die on the vine, and you're going to see once again the people, not necessarily the governments, but the people of societies looking towards the United States as the way that democracy should be. And you'll see once again, we'll be able to stand tall with allies and partners and show that democracy is a much better system than authoritarianism or totalitarianism. It might be more messy, but at the end of the day, it allows us to have a dialogue between us that enables for solutions to the problems that face us, whether they be medical solutions, whether they be technological solutions, whether they be societal solutions. We have the means within us and within our system to address those together in league with others, like-minded nations, and really as a people to rise to and to elevate the human condition. So thank you very much again for allowing me to participate. I enjoy the opportunity to share my thoughts with you today.
That is some frightening stuff. General Spalding has stitched together a sobering threat profile so comprehensive that the defense industrial base and really all of America should consider this a call to action. If now is not the time to act, when will it be? When is it too late? Tough questions that need answers.